First of all, the cover for this one is the New Yorker magazine. I've used that for this. We're going to talk a little bit about the Devonian today. Plants, tiktaalik, and we're going to talk a little bit more about a couple more extinctions. In fact, this image that you see in the cover of the New Yorker here is one from Watkins Glen. Watkins Glen is in New York, upstate New York, in an area they call the Finger Lakes. And coming into the Finger Lakes were actually gouged out by the last ice age with glaciers, huge glaciers came across the landscape, gouged out these huge areas that became lakes. And then in the shoulders of those lakes, rivers cut down into the shoulders, and it left these giant gorges behind. So this is one of the state parks in upstate New York. It's just absolutely stunningly beautiful. If you look at the second slide here, you'll see what I mean by that. Yeah, there we go. It is a place where they have walkways, tunnels, bridges, and things like that. So that is in Watkins Glen State Park in New York. And what they find there, in fact, is mostly Devonian age rocks, but in the Silurian, which we were last in the Silurian, there were stomatoporoid reefs, coral reefs, and in Michigan you get a lot of these things that actually produce oil and gas. It was during the Silurian that you got these sort of animals, the eurypterids over here. They're called sea scorpions. By the time you get into the Devonian, sea scorpions were everywhere. In fact, the sea scorpions became a favorite delicacy of the fish. The fishes actually came to prominence, and in fact, the Devonian time is known as the age of fishes. So that's probably going to be an exam question, so listen to that. So Devonian is an age of fishes. So there were only little tiny land plants that were around in the Silurian. By the time you get to the end of the Devonian, there are forests there. So the forests actually make an impact on the Earth's environment. Everything is going crazy on the seafloors at this time. You have a lot of diversity in the fossil life. Here's a slab of brachiopods, bryozoans. There are cephalopods on here as well, bivalves, all sorts of things that you can see on this slab of seafloor here. These slabs of seafloor are fairly common in the Devonian as well, actually common in the Ordovician, late Ordovician as well. But these things are regarded as what we call fossil seafloor, and the name for that is a hard ground. So a hard ground is what you see here from the Devonian. So that is what you would see in this case, the late Silurian here. Here's what the times look like back during Ordovician time. Here's what it looked like during Silurian time. And here's what it looked like during Devonian time. So what you see here is a progression of this Paleotethys Sea closing up. There is a convergence on the east margin of Laurentia, with Baltica coming in, with Siberia having already drifted away. And by the time you get into Devonian time, there are collisions going on all around the edge, all around the periphery of Laurentia, or what we today regard as North America. So that's the old name for the continent before it really became North America. So that's Laurentia. Here's a snapshot of what it would have looked like during late Devonian time as you had an approaching island arc off the east coast. It's called, in fact, the Avalon terrane. The Avalon terrane had a west part and an east part, and it was West Avalon that actually collided with Laurentia at that time, and so that gave us an interval known as the Acadian orogeny in the east. Now in the north, Siberia was up there, but there was a collision still, and that was called the Ellesmerian orogeny. And in the south, that's where we have Arkansas, right? And so part of the mountains in Arkansas would have begun to form during Devonian time, and that's called the Ouachita orogeny down there. And in the very far west, in places like Nevada, there was another collision going on with another island arc, and that's called the Antler orogeny. And so we have all these orogenies going on at this time. And it affected the life at that time as well. So the Acadian orogeny is shown here in map form, and it shows you where these things crop out. An orogeny is a mountain building event, and the area affected that actually had the mountains and everything, we call that the orogen. So an orogen is where the rocks were during that Acadian orogeny in this case. So that's the New England region here, you see. So in fact, where we were looking previously in in Watkins Glen. That's a little bit farther to the west. So this is the Catskill Mountains, in fact, that are just south of the Adirondacks here. And the Catskills at that time were accumulating sediment in what we call the Catskill Delta. So the Catskill Delta was active at that time. In the far west, here's what you get there. It was the disintegration of the carbonate platform that had formed during Devonian time. And here you see a whole bunch of Devonian limestone clasts redeposited in a breccia there. So it was essentially a bulldozer scraping off all the carbonates and redepositing them on that shelf. Here's what a cross section looks like. Now, this paper was written about 2002, 2003, I think, something like that, from the U.S. Geological Survey, so reputable source. And here they say, well, instead of maybe having an island arc crashing into the west coast, maybe it was just sliding on by. And they show you how the carbonate platform here has been cannibalized, and some of it was redeposited then on the seafloor here. That was the Antler orogeny. So the Antler orogeny and the Acadian orogeny, a couple of the Devonian orogenies that we have around, well, Laurentia at this time, or the nascent North American continent. So early Devonians saw a first spread of vascular plants on the land at this time. And the first forest had appeared then by the time you get into late Devonian. Now, if you think about what forests do, they produce a lot of oxygen. And when they do that, they actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? And so they produce, through photosynthesis, they take the carbon dioxide out of the air, they produce the oxygen. And if you remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you have a potential of not having global warming, but having global cooling. And so, in fact, that's what most people think happened during the late Devonian time. And in fact, the oceans went entirely anoxic at that time. And so there are black shales that blanket much of North America eventually at that time. They were sequestered in swamps, of course, but in these euxinic environments, that means without oxygen pretty much. You would have things like this being deposited. So we get a lot of preservation of colified or carbonized plants and things like that. And so here you can see some of the ferns. Now, most of the plants that were around back then were called bryophytes. So bryophytes, club mosses, all of these things actually were forming this Devonian forest. And so ferns and things like that would show up eventually here. And so here, in fact, you can see that a lot of that material, in fact, may have been preserved in some of the organic rich rocks, but it was also a time when we had a lot of fishes as well. So fishes are preserved in many of these rocks as well. In fact, we also get not just marine fishes, we get the first freshwater fishes during Devonian time as well. So when we walked through this interval, we had fishes all the way back in the Cambrian. Most of those fishes, in fact, did not have lower jaws. And so they were bottom feeders that would feed on detritus and scavengers, essentially, on the sea floor. Some of those, in fact, probably had some teeth, but they really didn't have jaws. They were able to grasp things and feed on things down there, but mostly scavengers, right? So that's a group called the agnathids. And the agnathids, in fact, are referred to as jawless fish on this diagram. And the next group over from that, so we're going to go through these fishes in a little bit of detail here because this is, after all, the age of fishes. And so here we have jawless fish, and then we have placoderms. Now, placoderms are wild looking. I think I posted a video on this from Eons, not the NPR, but the PBS affiliate sort of production. So Eons is what I've posted on there already. Those are for options, I guess. You can watch those things, but the placoderms are the types of fishes, in fact, that would have plates. So those plates were made out of carbonate material mostly, or calcium material, I guess you could say, calcium phosphate mostly, as I think about it. So the placoderms would have plates all over their heads, and then maybe eye-sensitive organs to begin with, and then eyes later on in the sides of their head. So that is the placoderms. The next group over would be a novelty that rose up out of the stem group for the placoderms then, and that's the cartilaginous fishes. Now, you today know the cartilaginous fishes as sharks and rays and skates. And so those are actually descendants of some of the earliest Devonian versions. So we'll take a look and see what Devonian sharks kind of looked like back then. They weren't nearly as big as some of what the placoderms were. The placoderms got to be enormously big and were predators back then. And so, we go on here. The ray-finned fish are out of Osteichthyes. Osteichthyes is the largest group that we see in the fishes today. And so both the ray-finned fishes and the lobe-finned fishes came out of a group called Osteichthyes, meaning bony fish. And so bony fish were not cartilaginous fish, but the spiny sharks, the ray-finned fish, and the lobe-finned fish, in fact, are all out of those. And they split off from the cartilaginous fish, the things like the sharks, rays, and skates. But eventually, those lobe-finned fishes over here on the far right side of the fishes here will give rise eventually to amphibians. And so amphibians will rise out of the lobe-finned fishes. And amphibians eventually will give us things we call amniotes today, but amniotes gave rise to reptiles, birds, and mammals, and things like that. So they came out of the lobe-finned fishes, we're pretty sure. So there is a transitional species we're going to talk about, a transitional genus anyway, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik, the species is Rosia, Rosie. And so this is, in fact, a chart that shows you the various kinds of fishes. So let's take a look at them. Hagfishes and lampreys are the living versions of the jawless fishes today. They're the only ones we know of. And the agnathid fishes, in fact, were the jawless variety. And so we also think that there were probably early chordates known as conodonts that may have been related to these as well. So, but in fact, the placoderms rise out of these fishes. So that's a hagfish there. This is what a lamprey looks like. And so lampreys are a little bit more sophisticated than the hagfishes, and certainly not as disgusting. Hagfishes are really slimy creatures. Hagfishes make their living by getting into other fish and eating them from the inside out. And then once they're finished with them, they'll lay their eggs in that dead fish, and then move on to the next fish that they can inhabit. So they're a very parasitic sort of lifestyle. Lampreys are not quite that gross, I guess you could say. But lampreys still kind of eel-like almost in their appearance here. Conodonts are, of course, the extinct group. They began in the late Cambrian and made it all the way into the Triassic. In fact, almost to the very end of the Triassic before they went extinct. It's a major extinction at the end of the Triassic that's going to take them out. These things on the right-hand side are images, SEM images of what it looks like for the teeth-like projections that these things would have had. And in fact, conodonts are so important in the rock record that people who study conodonts are in high demand in many places anyway, looking at carbonate rocks, because you can dissolve the carbonate rock away, and what you're left with in most marine settings are these conodonts. And so conodonts you can pick with a little brush, and then you can photograph them, identify them, and then write papers about them, and you can tell what age of rock you're looking at. And so these are conodonts on the right-hand side. They're regarded as what we call index fossils. Now, those features themselves are called elements, but the elements help us to identify the animal that actually made those sort of features. And so they're called index fossils in this case. So index fossils, in fact, are things that have evolved very rapidly. They have short taxonomic ranges, and then they have a widespread distribution. So they may be all around the world, in fact. So just by having one carbonate rock, giving it to a conodont specialist. We have one at Missouri State University. He's retired now, but he's actually a professor emeritus in geology. And so when you dissolve those rocks, you get these sort of elements out of there, you identify them, and then you're able to place them into a range chart, essentially, where they belong within that range chart. You'll be able to identify the age of those rocks then. So that's a hagfish on the left-hand side over here. Notice the person with the gloves on here. And so they have these little projections that help them to feed and chew through, they're scavengers, right? So they chew through the animal in order to get to the inside. On the right-hand side here, you can see how they've patterned and reconstructed what they think is a conodont animal from what looks like a hagfish over here. Now, it's a funny thing about conodonts. So conodonts, people always try to figure out exactly what they look like. and wanted to make reconstructions about what the conodont animal could have looked like. It's like finding human teeth and trying to figure out exactly what a human would look like just from their teeth. Not an easy task to do. And so people came up with all sorts of wild schemes about how conodonts looked, essentially. Sometimes there were rare preservation cases where you could actually see the entire conodont apparatus, they call it. It's a whole series of elements lined up, just like your teeth would be lined up in your mouth. They would find these arrangements of conodont elements in rocks, but usually you didn't find any of the soft parts because these are really not, they don't have bone. They think they had a primitive notochord, and they were probably more like with the chordates. Well, they were chordates, but they probably had more of a cartilaginous sort of like structure in there. Well, lo and behold, they were looking through some of the drawers and collections of conodonts, and they found some. Here's an apparatus preserved in this one. And when they looked at it very carefully, they could actually see the soft part preservation. They found that in Edinburgh, actually, in the Scottish Museum. And it's like, holy smokes, here's a conodont animal. And so they published on that back in, I think it was about the mid-1980s, late or early 1990s. So the conodont apparatus was then known. That is our jawless fish. We have 3 varieties of jawless fish, 2 that we recognize today. That's the hagfish and lampreys. In this extinct version, the conodonts, which were around from Cambrian all the way into the lower Triassic, or into the upper Triassic, in fact. They gave rise to these things. Now, this is a monster right here. This thing is huge. They grew up to 30 feet long, some of these things. They look like a shark. Well, that's what the reconstruction is, right? So nobody knows exactly what that looks like, but that's Duncleo osteus and pterali. And so this placoderm here had bony plates inside of its skeleton. It had actually 2 parts to its skeleton. It had the internal bones and all in the inside, and then there were the bony plates around the outside. And so these things were enormous. And they think that they probably fed upon eurypterids because they find bite marks out of the eurypterids. So these things, in fact, did not have teeth, but they had bones up here that would serve as teeth, essentially. So a primitive bone-like structure in the mouth here. Now, the actual plates on these things armored the skull area because that's the most fragile area of a fish, right? So, and you can actually tell that these were predators by the way their eyes are positioned as well. So the eyes are more focused to where they can get binocular vision. And you can see what a constructed head area of that placoderm would look like. And that would have been a pretty big one right there. So that skeleton, the skull alone here is about 2 feet long. So that would have been a 15-footer at least right there. So there were other placoderms around back at this time. This one's pterichthyoids, milleri over here on the left-hand side. And the guy who described it was actually Hugh Miller on the right-hand side here. And so Hugh Miller was a Scot, and he studied fish. He's an interesting guy. I actually wrote an article on him myself, and so because I'm interested in the history of geology. And so Hugh Miller was an orphan. He was raised by his mother and his uncle, and he had 2 sisters as well. His father was a sea captain. He was lost at sea. And anyway, he was raised in an area called Cromarty. It's on what they call the Black Isle. It's close to Inverness in that area, so it's that sort of embayment in the north of Scotland. And so he was raised on the shores of this thing, and he was, very precocious. He would actually want to know the answer to everything. And his uncle was a very good teacher. He was a natural scientist, I guess you could say. And so he taught him everything he could teach him, and then the rest of it Hugh Miller would read about. And so Hugh Miller worked for a living. He wasn't a gentleman like many of the other early geologists. In fact, he had a passion for rocks very early on. He began working in quarries to begin with, and so as he was working in quarries, he would discover fish and things like this, and he collected them. And so he would walk around what they call the towers of the suitors of the Black Isle there. So the suitors of Cromarty Bay, I guess it is, and so. He would collect these fishes, and he studied both Jurassic age ones and Devonian age ones. Both of those outcrop around the Black Isle. And so Hugh Miller here began to write about these things and correspond with other scientists. Remember that geology was just starting back in the early 1800s, and that's pretty much when he was around. And so He took a job as a bank clerk for a while in order to make a living, just so that he could marry the woman that he wanted to marry and show that he could, make a living out of this. And then eventually he left that position to become an editor of a newspaper in Edinburgh. And so he left to go to Edinburgh with his wife. But eventually he returned back to Cromarty in order to recuperate as a quarryman, as a person who was removing stone. He actually got silicosis. Now, silicosis is probably the number one leading disease for people who work with stone a lot. And so he actually had a mild variety, or maybe even a pretty bad variety of silicosis. He wrote so much geology. In fact, he wrote a book called The Old Red Sandstone, which was one of the most common rocks that is in Scotland today. It crops out pretty much everywhere across Scotland. So it crops out on the west coast of Britain in general. So you can see here some of the fish that he's described. That's his hammer down here on the lower left-hand side here. So studied fish. Here's some of the beds that he actually studied in Cromarty here. So that's my wife Nancy there against the outcrop here, and you can see the rocks are dipping there. Well, almost all of Scotland's been very deeply buried at one point, and then it's been deformed somewhat. And so what you get here are a series of Devonian rocks. And Devonian's what we're talking about today. And so he studied these Devonian fishes from outcrops like this. It takes a little patience to try to get these things. And he would prepare them, of course, too. Oh, well, I'm back onto the fishes here. We have this weird-looking fish here. That's a shark, actually, right there. It's a chondrichthyes. That's the cartilaginous fish. I didn't tell you that in that diagram. So far we've seen the agnathids, we've seen the placoderms, and now we're looking at chondrichthyes. So these were the things that were ancestors to the shark's rays, skates, and so forth. And so this is a really weird creature right here, okay? You see that little mushroom-like thing on top of its head here. And most people, there was a series of fibers, essentially, that are in that feature. And they're actually like little balloons almost, some of them, and so they would actually inflate, and people think it was one of the first mating sort of apparatuses, I guess you could say, with some of the cartilaginous fish here. They only find them in the males, and so the males have these on top of their head or on top of where their dorsal spine would sort of be right there, and they're showing a female in the back right there. So you can actually see that there was probably a little bit of sexual dimorphism even as far back as Devonian time here in some of the fishes. And so we finally get to the bony fishes. Here's some illustrations. It looks like a little bit like the Simpsons fish, with the 3 eyes there, but these only had 2 eyes. And so here are some ray-finned fishes, and they're pretty common, in fact, over here on the right-hand side. That's Ernest Hemingway with a couple of ray-finned fishes there that he caught off of Key West in Florida here. So he was an avid fisherman, of course. If you didn't know this, Ernest Hemingway also shot himself in the leg. He caught a shark one time, and they got it into the boat, and he was trying to kill the shark, and he shot his leg by accident. They question whether he was actually sober at the time when he shot himself, but he survived that. So that is Ernest Hemingway and a bunch of osteoichthyes here. Well, coming out of the osteoichthyes were a group called the lobe-finned fishes, and these are really pretty odd. You can kind of see how their forearms are essentially, they look like forearms, but they're really lobes that stick out there, on which their fins would actually be an extension of that lobe. They had them front and back, and what's really weird about this is they thought that these were extinct for 70 million years. And then they caught one. They're called coelacanths. And so coelacanths, they caught one off of the coast of South Africa in 1938. It's a very interesting story, in fact. So the coelacanth was caught by fishermen off of South Africa. They brought it ashore, and one of the folks that was walking along that shoreline, her name was Latimer. And so Miss Latimer came along, she saw the fish and says, I got to preserve this thing because I've never seen anything like this. And neither are the fishermen, for that matter. So she took it, had it taxidermied, and so they preserved it that way as best they could. Most of the time when they catch these fishes, they're completely eviscerated, because when you take something that is caught at great depth and bring it up to the surface, the air bladder usually causes it to like totally disgorge its interior, and you only have left the meat then. And so in here, in this case, they had the entire fish, and so they brought it in, they preserved it. I'll try to put a link up actually, because there's a pretty neat little animation for the coelacanth. But the coelacanth actually dates all the way back to Devonian times. So some people consider this to be a living fossil. Okay, so in other words, it's something that was found as a fossil first, and then they caught it. And so my hope is that they'll eventually find trilobites in the deep sea as well, but I kind of doubt that. The lungfish are the other variety of lobe-finned fish, and here you can see one, and they crawl around like a mud skipper sort of thing. And so this is one, I guess they find these in, this one's from Australia right here. In fact, they gave it a name, in fact. This was in the Shed Aquarium in Chicago for many, many years, but they had to euthanize it back in 2017 because it was going through organ failure, but it was over 90 years old. So really, really ancient sort of fish that was still around that had been caught from the 1930s, in fact. So that is a lungfish right here, another variety of lobe-finned fishes. And so the lobe-finned fishes like that gave rise to this. This has only been found as a fossil. And so this is called, it's a sarcopterygian. That is the lobe-finned fishes. They used to call them crossopterygian, okay, but they now refer to them as sarcopterygian fishes. And this is Tiktaalik. And you may have heard about Tiktaalik. They found it in the Arctic north of Canada. And so it gave rise, most people think, to the early tetrapods because it had these lobe fins, and they're pretty sure that this thing was able to crawl on dry land just like the amphibians, the early amphibians were able to do. Now, it's important to note that this is not an amphibian. It is the last vestige of what we have of what we think could have been the ancestor to the amphibians. It is a sarcopterygian fish. So it's still the fish. So you have to... some people say embrace your inner fish, essentially. So here's a diagram, kind of a cartoon that shows you the difference between what the lobe-finned fishes are like and what the early amphibians were like. And so it's not a hard stretch of the imagination to figure out that something eventually came ashore, and it was probably something that Tiktaalik gave rise to at some later point in the Devonian. Now, these things were transitional, and the tetrapods means 4 feet, right? So tetrapods were 4-footed things, but they made it through what's going to be one of the worst extinctions on Earth. There's Big 5, they call them, in fact. So when we talk about the Big 5 extinctions, we've already talked about one. That is the end or the terminal Ordovician extinction. This is the second one. And so this one's a 2-pulsed sort of extinction. There are 2 times in the late Devonian where there were mass extinctions, and one of them is called the Franian-Famanian boundary, and the other one was before that, in fact. And so they give these things event names, in fact. And so one of them is called the Hangenberg event, and the other one is called the, I'd have to think about it a little bit, but anyway, the Franian-Famanian was one of those sort of events. And so, but the amphibians made it through. Yeah, not everything else did. Some of the fishes, in fact, went away at that time. During late Devonian, as we talked about, there are these forests covering the landscape, and if you pump too much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, in fact, you're going to get an ice age. And that's what happened back then. So there were ice ages. The ice age, in fact, was in Africa, in part of Gondwana, that little chunk of Gondwana that's the African part. There were glacial deposits of this age during the Devonian, and so across many of the other continents, well, certainly North America, certainly in Laurentia, there would have been black shales deposited at this time. And in fact, we give one of those black shales a name. It's called the Chattanooga Shale, so named for Chattanooga, Tennessee. It crops out all along the southern Appalachians, all along the south coast, essentially through Tennessee into Missouri and on over into Oklahoma. In fact, where it's, I think there it is it's still the Chattanooga Shale. Anyway, because it's an organic rich shale, it's actually loaded, and so there was a sequestration of that excess carbon at this time, and that gave rise to some of the most prolific oil production ever in the mid-continent of North America. And so those kerogens that were preserved in these black shales would be the source then for petroleum that we still exploit today in places like southern Oklahoma, well, actually some southern Oklahoma, but also northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas. where it's in a play known as the Mississippi Lime. The overlying rocks, in fact, are the rocks that contain the oil that was actually originally produced out of these rocks, which were late Devonian in age. So that is kind of a snapshot of what the Devonian was like. It was an age of fishes. It was an age of the first forests on this landscape, from small plants into really large plants. How large? Well, maybe 4 or 5 meters high. And so still not not redwood quality sort of like plants, but in fact these were things that were enough to reduce the oxygen, well, increase the oxygen, but to reduce the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. So if you're at the end of the Devonian, you could have died from 2 mass extinctions. And so one more time, when we talk about these mass extinctions, we have the terminal Ordovician. We have the 2 at the end of the Devonian there. That's considered, you lump them together usually. It's the Hagenberg and the Kellwasser event. That's what it's called. So Kellwasser and Hagenberg events are in Germany. And that's where some of these rocks were first described, in fact. So that is the Devonian extinctions. That's the second one. The third one's going to come along, and it's going to be one of the worst. In fact, it is the worst, and that's the terminal Permian event. So the terminal Permian event pretty much killed off everything except for a handful of things. So I think it's like 95% of species went extinct in the end Permian extinction. The 2 that are left then are the one that's at the end of the Triassic. That's another major extinction, and that's the one that killed off the conodonts. And then the one at the end of the Cretaceous, and that's the one that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. And so those are what we call the Big 5. So the Big 5 are terminal Ordovician, end of the Devonian, terminal Permian, and then the end of the Triassic, and then the end of the Cretaceous. So that's enough for now anyway. Thanks for your attention. This is the Devonian. The next one's going to be a little bit longer than this, so we're going to talk about all of those rocks between the Devonian and the end of the Permian, and that's going to be number 16. So that's going to be episode 16 in this series. So anyway, thanks for your attention, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye now.